He grabbed her arm in front of the entire hangar and shoved her toward the door. "Get off my base," he said. "Now." She turned around slowly, looked at the hand still on her arm, then looked at him with the kind of stillness that doesn't come from training. It comes from having survived things that would break most people. "You have no idea who you just touched," she said. He laughed. His men laughed with him. 12 minutes later, a SEAL Blackhawk descended on his base, unannounced, and every man who laughed went completely silent. Subscribe and follow this story to the end. Comment your city. I want to see how far this reaches. The arm grab lasted maybe 3 seconds. But those 3 seconds would define everything that happened next. Captain Derek Holloway had not planned to make a scene. That was the irony of it. He was a man who prided himself on control, on precision, on the kind of measured authority that came from 12 years of commanding people who were better at taking orders than asking questions. He did not raise his voice. He did not use profanity. He simply crossed the hangar floor with the particular walk of a man who had never once been told no by someone he outranked, reached out and closed his fingers around Commander Claire Donovan's left forearm, with the casual confidence of a person who fully expected the gesture to end the matter. It did not end the matter. Claire stopped walking. She did not gasp. She did not flinch. She did not immediately pull away. She simply stopped the way a person stops when they've stepped on something unexpected and are deciding whether it's worth addressing. Then she looked down at his hand. Then she looked up at his face. And every Marine in that hangar, every one of the 40-plus personnel who had stopped what they were doing the moment Derek started moving, held their breath. "Remove your hand," she said. No anger in it, no tremor. The kind of flat, quiet certainty that doesn't need volume because it's never been ignored. Derek Holloway smiled. It was not a kind smile. It was the smile of a man performing confidence for an audience he knew was watching. "Commander," he said, and he said the title the way some people say it when they don't believe in the rank. "You arrived at my installation this morning without notice, without coordination, without a single member of my senior staff having any idea you were coming. You've been walking around my operation for 6 hours, asking my people questions I haven't authorized, and looking at systems that are none of your concern. So I'm going to need you to explain yourself, or I'm going to need you to leave." "Remove your hand," she said again. Exact same tone, exact same volume. Something flickered across Derek's face. Not quite uncertainty. More like the moment when a person realizes the ground beneath them is not as solid as they assumed. He let go. Claire lowered her arm. She did not rub the spot where he'd grabbed her. She did not look around to gauge the reaction of the people watching. She simply looked at him the way a surgeon looks at a symptom with professional interest and absolutely no alarm. "I'll be in the operations bay," she said. "When you're ready to have a real conversation, you know where to find me." Then she walked away. Derek stood there for 2 full seconds. Then he turned to his XO Major Vincent Reyes, who was standing 3 feet away with the careful expression of a man trying very hard not to have a visible reaction. "Find out everything about her," Derek said quietly. "Everything. Clearance level chain of command, who sent her, why she's here. I want it on my desk in an hour." Vincent nodded. "Already tried, sir." "And?" Vincent paused just a fraction too long. "Her file is restricted, above our access level." Derek stared at him. "How far above?" "I'm not sure I can answer that, sir." The hangar had gone back to noise. Tools clanging, engines running, personnel resuming the business of a busy tactical air installation. But the 2 men stood in the middle of it, as if the sound had nothing to do with them, and Derek Holloway felt the first genuine stirring of something he almost never experienced. Unease. Tateg. Claire Donovan had been awake since 03:30. Not because she couldn't sleep, she could sleep anywhere in almost any conditions, a skill acquired over years in environments where rest was a tactical resource. She had been awake because she always spent the early hours of a new assignment doing the same thing, sitting with what she already knew, turning it over, looking for the piece that didn't fit. Fort Ravencrest Tactical Air Base had the best inspection scores in the region. 3 consecutive quarters of top-tier readiness ratings. 0 major incidents reported in 14 months. Personnel evaluations that read like recruiting brochures. By every visible metric, it was the kind of installation that senior commanders pointed to when they needed an example of what right looked like. Claire had stopped believing in perfect scores approximately 8 years ago. She had learned that lesson the hard way, at a forward operating base in a country she wasn't technically supposed to be in, where a unit with flawless evaluation results had lost 4 people in a single night, because nobody had felt safe enough to report a pattern of equipment failures that everyone below sergeant knew about. The senior staff had not been malicious. They had not deliberately ignored the problem. They had simply built a culture so obsessed with the appearance of excellence that the actual mechanics of survival had gotten quietly buried underneath it. She had spent the next 8 years of her career learning to look for that. The buried thing. The thing that was never in any report because the person who saw it understood at the gut level that reporting it would cost them something they couldn't afford. That was why she was at Ravencrest, not because anyone had told her to go. She was here because 3 months ago, a routine cross-base logistics audit had turned up a statistical anomaly, not a dramatic one, not the kind of thing that would trigger an alarm, but the kind of subtle departure from expected variance that only someone looking for it would notice. The number of informal maintenance requests at Ravencrest had dropped by 63% over an 18-month period. Not the formal ones. The informal ones. The fix this before it becomes something kind. The ones that came from junior technicians who noticed something and wanted someone to know about it. 63%. Either Ravencrest had the most reliable fleet of aircraft in the history of military aviation, or the people who saw problems had stopped feeling safe enough to say so. Claire had submitted a personal request to conduct an independent operational review. It had been approved by people significantly above Derek Holloway's pay grade. Nobody had told Derek it was coming, because the moment you told a commander that someone was coming to look at his blind spots, the blind spots disappeared, not because they were fixed, but because they were hidden more carefully. Which meant that at 0600, when Claire had walked through the gate at Ravencrest with nothing but her credentials, her notebook, and the particular quality of stillness that came from years of operating in situations where drawing attention was the thing most likely to get you killed. She had already known 3 things. First, the base had a problem. Second, the base didn't know it had a problem. Third, the moment anyone realized she was there to find it, they would do everything in their power to make her leave. Derek Holloway had not disappointed. The operations bay was a long rectangular space with the organized clutter of a place where real work happened. Not the performance of work, but the actual thing with all the residue it left behind. Maintenance logs stacked on the far table. Scheduling boards covered in overlapping handwriting. A coffee maker that looked like it had been running continuously since the previous administration. When Claire entered, the 3 personnel already in the room went through a familiar sequence: initial glance assessment, the decision about whether to acknowledge her. The oldest of them, a heavy-set staff sergeant named Garza, made the first move. "Help you with something, Commander." "I'm going to be reviewing some of your maintenance coordination logs," Claire said. She pulled out a chair without asking. "Don't change your routine on my account." Garza looked at the other 2, a young specialist named Torres, and a corporal whose name badge read Whitfield, with the expression of a person who had just been told not to worry about the weather right before it started raining. "Yes, ma'am," he said carefully. Claire opened her notebook and uncapped a pen. Not a tablet, not a laptop. A pen the old-fashioned kind, which had a way of making people feel like the information she gathered wasn't going anywhere digital. It was a small thing, but small things mattered when you were trying to get people to talk. "How long have you been here, Sergeant Garza?" 3 years, ma'am." "And in 3 years, how often has the maintenance log gotten a formal review by senior staff?" Garza blinked. It was a reasonable question, on the surface routine, bureaucratic, the kind a standard inspector might ask. But something in the specificity of it made him stop and actually think before answering. "Quarterly," he said. "Senior staff reviews it quarterly. And informally between formal reviews. I'd have to check the records." "Sure," Claire said pleasantly. She was already writing something in her notebook. "While you're thinking about that, When's the last time someone from your team put in an informal maintenance flag that made it to Captain Holloway's desk? The silence lasted approximately half a beat longer than it should have. I couldn't say off the top of my head, ma'am. Claire looked up. She didn't press. She simply looked at Garza with the particular patience of a person who had all the time in the world and every intention of using it. He shifted his weight. Things get handled at the appropriate level, he finally said. Of course they do. Claire agreed. She wrote something else. Thank you, Sergeant. She found Ethan Parker by accident, which was usually how the most important discoveries happened. She had been walking the maintenance corridor behind Hangar 3 when she heard voices not loud, not alarmed, but the specific urgent quietness of two people disagreeing about something that mattered. She stopped. I'm telling you what the numbers say, a young male voice was arguing. The hydraulic pressure reading is inconsistent. It's been inconsistent for 3 weeks. I've run the diagnostic 4 times. I heard you the first 3 times, Parker. A second voice responded, older, tired, the tone of a man who had navigated too many of these conversations. And I'm telling you what I told you the first 3 times. The diagnostic threshold on that system has a variance range built in. What you're seeing is within tolerance. It's at the top of the tolerance range every single time. That's not variance, that's a pattern. Parker, if that pattern continues another 2 weeks, we're going to have a flight with a hydraulic issue that was documented and ignored. A pause. I'll note your concern in the maintenance record, the older voice said. The sentence had the flat finality of a door closing. That's what you said last time. And that's what I'm saying this time. We're done here. Claire waited. Footsteps. The sound of someone walking away fast. The particular rhythm of a person who is furious and has nowhere to put it. Then the young soldier came around the corner and nearly walked directly into her. He was maybe 23. A technician's uniform, hands that were roughed from real work. A face that in that moment was carrying about 40 more years of frustration than it should have had to. He stopped short and snapped to the appropriate posture. Commander, sorry ma'am, I didn't see you. At ease, Claire said. She studied him for a moment. Ethan Parker. He blinked. Yes, ma'am. Walk with me. He hesitated just a fraction, the reflex of someone who had learned that going out of his lane had consequences. Then he fell into step beside her. Tell me about the hydraulic system, she said. His head turned sharply. Ma'am, the one you've run diagnostics on 4 times. Tell me what you're seeing. The silence lasted long enough that she let it sit. Let him process the fact that she wasn't a trap, wasn't a test, wasn't going to take whatever he said and fold it back on him. When he finally started talking, he talked like a person releasing pressure that had been building for weeks. Technical, specific, organized, the account of someone who had been thinking about this so long that every detail was perfectly sequenced. He had first flagged the anomaly 22 days ago. He had filed an informal report. The report had been reviewed by his direct supervisor, Master Sergeant Callahan, who had determined the reading was within tolerance. Parker had rerun the diagnostic 6 days later. The variance had increased. He had flagged it again. He had been told again that it was within tolerance. He had gone to Callahan a 3rd time with documented trend data showing the progressive nature of the issue. Callahan had told him in words that Parker quoted with the precision of someone who had memorized them. I know you think you're being thorough. What you're actually being is a problem. He had not filed a 4th report. Why not? Claire asked. Ethan Parker looked at her. He was quiet for a moment. Because the last time I pushed something up the chain that the chain didn't want to hear. I spent 6 weeks on the worst assignment rotation on the base. And the time before that, I got a performance note that said, I had difficulty integrating team consensus. Which apparently means that when everyone else says the sky isn't falling, you're not supposed to keep pointing at the sky. He said it without self-pity. That was the thing that got her. Just factual. Just the reality of how things worked here, stated plainly by a young man who had decided somewhere along the way that accurate information was not the point. Show me the data, Claire said. By the time Derek Holloway found her for the 2nd time, She had been sitting with Ethan Parker's documented trend analysis for 2 hours, and she had found 3 other technicians with similar stories, each one slightly different in its specifics, each one identical in its underlying structure. Person notices problem. Person reports problem. Problem is minimized. Person learns that noticing problems has a cost. Person stops noticing problems. Derek came in with Major Reyes at his shoulder and the particular expression of a man who had spent the morning working himself into a certainty and was ready to deliver it. Commander Donovan. He stopped in front of the table where she was sitting. I've had my JAG officer review the parameters of your authorization, and I want to be very clear about what it does and does not permit. Claire set down her pen. I'd love to hear it, she said. You have authorization to review documentation related to logistics coordination. You do not have authorization to conduct interviews with my personnel. You do not have authorization to access maintenance records outside of the designated inspection window. And you do not. He leaned forward slightly. Have authorization to take informal statements from junior technicians and present them as findings. Who told you I was doing that? Derek straightened. Something moved behind his eyes. I run this installation, Commander. I know what happens here. Claire looked at him steadily. Do you? Excuse me. She picked up Ethan Parker's datasheet from the table and turned it face up toward him. This is a hydraulic pressure trend analysis documented by one of your technicians over a 22-day period. He filed formal concerns twice. Both were dismissed. The trend line, if you follow it to its current projection, intersects with a failure threshold in approximately 8 to 14 days. If that aircraft flies before the issue is addressed, you have a serious incident. Derek stared at the paper. Then he looked at Claire. That technician has a history of... Don't, Claire said quietly. The word was not loud. It was not aggressive. But it stopped him with the efficiency of something solid placed in a doorway. Don't tell me he has a history, she continued. Tell me whether the data is wrong. Look at it, the actual numbers. Tell me whether the trend line is not what it appears to be. Derek looked at the paper again. Longer this time. Something shifted in his posture, almost imperceptible, the slight forward curve of a man's shoulders, when his certainty runs into the specific gravity of a fact he cannot immediately dismiss. I'll have my senior maintenance officer review it, he said. Good, Claire replied. In the meantime, I'd recommend grounding that aircraft for a full inspection. You don't have the authority to recommend grounding one of my aircraft. No, Claire agreed pleasantly. But you do. And now you have documented trend analysis showing a potential hydraulic failure. Which means, if that aircraft has an incident in the next 14 days, and your maintenance officer's review shows you saw this data and didn't act on it. She let the sentence end there, because the end of it didn't need saying. Derek's jaw tightened. He picked up the paper. I'll have it reviewed, he said again. He left. Major Reyes lingered for exactly 1 second. Long enough to look at Claire with an expression that was not quite an apology and not quite solidarity, but something in the complicated territory between them. Then he followed his commanding officer out. Claire turned back to her notebook. She had 4 more interviews to conduct before the day was over. The picture that emerged over the following hours was not dramatic. That was the insidious part of it. There was no single villain, no deliberate conspiracy, no moment where someone had sat in a room and decided to put personnel at risk. What there was instead was something quieter and more corrosive, a culture that had learned over time to optimize for the appearance of performance rather than its substance. Derek Holloway was not a bad commander. He was, in fact, a genuinely talented one, experienced, committed, technically skilled, the kind of leader who inspired real loyalty from the people who worked with him. But he had built his reputation on results, on numbers, on being the installation that other installations were measured against. And somewhere in the process of building that, the feedback mechanisms had quietly broken. It started small. An evaluation cycle where a critical report had gotten softened before it went up the chain, because the senior NCO who wrote it knew that bad numbers had a way of reflecting on the people reporting them as much as the things being reported. A counseling session where a junior technician had been told with the best intentions that the way to succeed here was to be a team player and bring solutions, not problems. A leadership philosophy that valued confidence and initiative, and without meaning to, had created an environment where uncertainty, the honest acknowledgement that something might be wrong, felt like weakness. Claire had seen it before. She would see it again. It was the most common serious failure mode in high-performing units, and it was invisible from the inside, precisely because the metrics all looked right. She was writing her initial assessment notes when the door opened and Ethan Parker appeared. He looked different than he had that morning, not scared exactly, but with the careful expression of someone navigating unfamiliar terrain. "Commander." He stopped in the doorway. "I heard you showed my data to Captain Holloway." "I did." He absorbed that. Should I be worried about that?" Claire looked at him directly. "No. Do you know why?" He shook his head. "Because the data is accurate. And accurate data is not something you should ever have to worry about having reported." She paused. "I'm also going to document in my review that you identified this issue 22 days ago and filed concerns through appropriate channels. That documentation will be part of the permanent record." Something happened in Ethan Parker's face. Not relief exactly. It was more like watching someone set down something they'd been carrying for a while without realizing how heavy it had gotten. "Thank you, ma'am," he said. "Thank you," Claire replied. "You did the right thing. 3 times. That matters." He nodded once. He was about to leave, then he stopped, turned back. "Ma'am, can I ask something?" "Go ahead." "Why does it seem like you already knew before you talked to any of us? You came in like you already understood what you were going to find." Claire considered the question. "Because I've seen it before," she said finally. "The details are always different. The shape is always the same. The best-looking units are sometimes the ones most at risk, because the better something looks, the harder it is for the people inside it to admit it might have problems." She looked at him. "You admitted it. That's not a small thing." Ethan Parker stood there for another moment. Then he nodded and left. Claire picked up her pen. She had 3 more hours of work to do before dinner. And tomorrow she expected was going to be considerably harder than today. Because by tomorrow, Derek Holloway was going to have had time to think. And a man like Derek Holloway, when he had time to think, became one of 2 things. Either he became the kind of commander who could hear a hard truth and decide to do something about it, or he became the kind of commander who decided the problem was the person who brought the truth. She had met both kinds. She was about to find out which one he was. At 21:40 hours. Major Vincent Reyes knocked on the door of the small office. Claire had been allocated a repurposed storage room with a folding table and a chair that had seen better decades. Reyes was a careful man, the kind who listened more than he spoke and survived long careers by understanding exactly which battles were worth fighting. He stood in the doorway for a moment, taking inventory of the room with the practiced discretion of someone who wanted to know what he was walking into. "I'm not here officially," he said. "I figured," Claire replied. "Sit down." He sat. He was quiet for a moment, the way a person is quiet when they're choosing between several true things and trying to figure out which one is appropriate to say. "The captain is preparing a formal objection to your review," he said finally. "He's going to argue that your authorization scope is narrower than you're operating within. He has JAG working on it tonight." "I know," Claire said. Reyes looked at her. "You know? I've been doing this a while, Major. This is usually around the time the formal objection happens." He sat with that for a moment. "He's not a bad man," he said. "I want you to understand that. He genuinely believes this installation is—" "I know that too," Claire said. Not dismissively, just factually. Reyes was quiet again. Then, with the deliberateness of someone making a decision they've been sitting with for a while. "There's a flight scheduled for 06:30 tomorrow. Advanced training exercise. 6 aircraft. The hydraulic issue. Parker identified the one Holloway took the data on tonight." "Is the affected aircraft scheduled for that flight?" Claire asked. Reyes didn't answer immediately, which was itself an answer. "The formal review hasn't concluded yet," he said carefully. "The senior maintenance officer is completing his assessment." "When is that assessment due?" 0600. Claire looked at him. "And if the assessment concludes the aircraft is within tolerance, it flies at 0630. Reyes said nothing. "And you're telling me this," Claire said, "because you think the assessment might conclude it's within tolerance regardless of what the data shows." Vincent Reyes stood up. He smoothed the front of his uniform with both hands, a small, precise gesture. "I'm not telling you anything, Commander," he said. "I'm just a major who got lost on the way to the break room and ended up in the wrong office." He left. Claire sat for a moment looking at the space where he'd been. Then she picked up her phone and made a call. The other end answered on the second ring. "It's Donovan," she said. "I need you to be available at 0500. Bring your clearance." She listened. "Yes," she said. "It's that kind of situation." She ended the call and went back to her notes. Outside Fort Ravencrest settled into its nighttime rhythm, the hum of equipment, the distant sound of an aircraft on approach, the particular texture of a military installation after dark, when the performance of the day gave way to the actual business of keeping it running. Inside, a woman in a repurposed storage room was writing the kind of report that tends to change things. And somewhere above the base, moving through the dark at altitude, a Black Hawk helicopter that nobody had called yet was already repositioning. Because the people who flew it had been watching Ravencrest for longer than Ravencrest knew, and they were very good at knowing exactly when to be somewhere. Vincent Reyes had not slept. That was the first thing Claire noticed when she walked into the corridor at 0510 and found him standing outside her door with a paper cup of coffee in each hand, and the expression of a man who had spent the night making a decision he wasn't entirely sure about. He held out one of the cups. She took it. "The senior maintenance officer submitted his assessment at 0445, Reyes said. 45 minutes ahead of schedule." Claire drank her coffee. "And aircraft is cleared for the 0630 exercise." The hallway was quiet. Somewhere down the corridor, a door opened and closed. Footsteps. The base was waking up around them, the slow machinery of a military installation, shifting from nighttime operations into the full gear of a training day. "Show me the assessment," Claire said. Reyes reached into the folder he was carrying under his arm and produced 2 pages. Claire read them standing in the corridor. She read them twice. Then she handed them back. "The variance threshold citation in paragraph 3, she said. "Which technical manual is that pulled from?" Reyes looked at her carefully. "The 2019 maintenance standard." "The 2019 standard was superseded in March of last year," Claire said. "The updated threshold is 14% lower, which means the reading Parker documented is not within tolerance. It is in fact 11 points above the current acceptable ceiling." Reyes stared at her. "Did the maintenance officer know that?" he asked slowly. "I don't know," Claire said. "But someone should have. And if nobody in this building knows that the standard they're using to clear aircraft for flight is 16 months out of date, then we have a problem that is considerably larger than one hydraulic system." She handed the cup back to him, still half full. "Get me in front of Holloway," she said. "Right now." Derek was already at his desk when they arrived. He was a man who ran on early mornings and controlled environments, and when Claire walked into his office at 0518 with Reyes behind her and a specific kind of purpose in the way she moved, his first instinct was to stand up, not out of respect, but out of the physical reflex of a man who sensed that the dynamic in the room was shifting and wanted to be on his feet when it finished shifting. "Commander," he said. The word had less edge in it than it had the day before. Whatever he'd expected from the night's formal objection process, something about the look on Reyes's face was telling him the morning had already gotten away from him. "The maintenance assessment that cleared your aircraft for the 0630 exercise," Claire said, "references a technical standard that was superseded 14 months ago. Under the current standard, the hydraulic pressure reading Parker documented is 11 points above the acceptable ceiling. That aircraft cannot fly this morning." Derek's expression went through 3 phases in approximately 2 seconds. First, the automatic resistance of a man who had been challenged. Second, the particular stillness of someone hearing something that requires actual processing. Third, and this was the one Claire was watching for, a flicker of something that might have been genuine alarm. "That's a serious claim," he said. "Yes," Claire agreed. "It is." "You're certain about the standard change? I have the updated technical manual on my tablet if you'd like to verify it yourself. The revision date is March 14th of last year. The notification went to all tactical air installations." Derek looked at Reyes. Reyes gave him a very small nod that communicated more than most full sentences could have. Derek reached for his phone. He made a call. He spoke for 40 seconds. Then he put the phone down and looked at the surface of his desk for a moment. "I'm pulling the aircraft from the exercise," he said quietly. "Good," Claire said. "I want to know how this happened." He looked up. "I want to know how my maintenance officer submitted a clearance assessment citing an outdated standard." "So do I," Claire said. "But right now, I'd like to know something else." He waited. "How many other active assessments on this base are using the 2019 standard?" The silence that followed that question was the loudest thing that had happened since she arrived. It took 3 hours to find out. Claire Reyes and a warrant officer named Chen, who turned out to be the sharpest technical mind on the installation, spent the morning pulling every active maintenance assessment filed in the last 90 days. Chen was 28 years old, relentlessly precise, and had the particular energy of someone who had been quietly correct about things for years, and was experiencing the unfamiliar sensation of being in a room where being correct was actually the point. "Here," Chen said, pushing a document across the table. "And here, this one too." 7 assessments. 7 active evaluations of aircraft systems that had been conducted using the superseded standard. Of the 7, 3 showed readings that would have required a different determination and different action under the current threshold. 3 aircraft that had potentially been flying with unaddressed system issues for weeks. Claire set the documents in a row. She looked at them for a long moment without speaking. "How did the standard update not get implemented?" she asked. Chen pulled up something on his laptop, turned it toward her. The notification came through in March. It was logged by the base administrative coordinator. It was supposed to go to the senior maintenance officer for distribution to all technical staff. He paused. "There's no record of that distribution happening." "Was there follow-up?" "There should have been a confirmation of receipt from each department. There are no confirmations on file." Claire looked at him. "Which means either nobody sent it, nobody logged the confirmations, or the confirmations were filed somewhere they can't currently be found." "Yes, ma'am," Chen said. "Any of those 3. Or," Reyes said quietly from the corner. "Someone received it and made a decision not to distribute it because implementing the new standard would have required grounding several aircraft during a period when the base's readiness metrics were under review." The room went very still. Nobody said anything for almost 10 seconds. "That," Claire said carefully, "is a very specific hypothesis, Major." "Yes," Reyes said. "It is." She studied him. "Is it a hypothesis, or is it something you have a reason to believe?" Vincent Reyes had the look of a man standing at the edge of something. He'd been there before she could tell by the way he handled it, the careful measurement of what he was about to say, against what he'd spent years learning about the cost of saying too much. "6 months ago," he said, "we were up for a regional readiness review, the kind that determines budget allocations for the following fiscal year. Grounding multiple aircraft for system inspections in the 30 days before that review would have significantly impacted our readiness numbers." He stopped. "I'm not saying that's why the notification wasn't distributed. I'm saying that's the context in which it didn't get distributed." Claire wrote something in her notebook. "I need to speak with the senior maintenance officer," she said. Master Sergeant Harold Briggs was 51 years old and had 26 years in the military, which meant he had survived long enough to develop the particular armor of a man who had weathered many storms and learned that the best way to survive the next one was to look like it wasn't a storm at all. He came into the room with the controlled ease of a man who had decided in advance how this conversation was going to go. "Commander," he said, settling into the chair across from her with the comfort of someone who had sat across from inspectors before and come out the other side. "Thank you for your time, Master Sergeant," Claire said. "I want to talk about the maintenance standard notification from March of last year." Briggs's expression didn't change. That was the tell. A man genuinely surprised by a question shows it for at least half a second. Briggs showed nothing, which meant he had already known this question was coming and had prepared for it. "The March notification," he said, as if searching his memory. "There were several notifications that month. Can you be specific?" Claire slid the document across the table. "The updated hydraulic pressure threshold standard, revision date March 14th. Briggs picked it up. "Read it with the performance of someone reading it for the first time." "Set it back down." "I'd have to check the distribution records to confirm when my office processed this." "The distribution records show your office received it," Claire said. "They don't show it being distributed to technical staff." "Then there may have been an administrative oversight," Briggs said smoothly. "These things happen. We process a significant volume of 3 aircraft flew on potentially unaddressed system issues as a result of assessments that used the outdated standard," Claire said. Her voice was completely level. "One of them, as of this morning, has a documented hydraulic variance pattern that was reported by a technician 22 days ago and was twice dismissed." Briggs was quiet. "That technician's name is Ethan Parker," Claire continued. "You know that name." Something moved behind Briggs's eyes. Not quite guilt, closer to the look of a man recalibrating the situation. "Parker is a capable technician," Briggs said carefully. "He's an excellent technician," Claire corrected. "He identified a real problem 3 weeks before it became critical, reported it through appropriate channels, and was told he misunderstood the data. He was told that by people using a standard that was already 14 months out of date." She paused. "I want to know who made the decision not to distribute the March notification, Master Sergeant. And I want to know why." The silence stretched. Briggs looked at the document on the table. Then he looked at Claire. And for a moment, just a moment, the armor slipped, and she saw something underneath it that was not defiance and not calculation. It was the look of a man who had made a decision a long time ago that had seemed reasonable at the time, and who was only now sitting in a room where all the downstream consequences of that decision were being laid out in front of him in a row. "I'd like to speak with the base legal officer," he said. "Of course," Claire said. "That's your right." She stood up, collected her notebook. At the door, she stopped without turning around. "Master Sergeant, the aircraft that flew under those assessments, did you ever believe they were safe?" A long pause. "I believe the risk was within manageable parameters," he said quietly. Claire nodded once to no one in particular. She walked out. Derek Holloway was waiting in the corridor. He had clearly been there for a while. He had the posture of a man who had walked up and down the same stretch of hallway several times, and then made himself stop, and the expression of someone who had heard through the particular acoustic properties of military buildings and 2 closed doors the general shape of what had just happened without the specific words. "He asked for legal," Derek said. "It wasn't a question." "Yes," Claire said. Derek turned and walked beside her. They moved through the corridor in silence for a moment, the kind of silence that has weight in it, the kind that sits between 2 people who are navigating toward the same difficult fact from different directions. "I didn't know about the March notification," Derek said. "I know you didn't," Claire said. He looked at her sharply. "How do you know?" "Because if you had known and you had made the decision not to implement it, you would not have pulled the aircraft this morning. You would have let it fly and hoped nothing happened." She glanced at him. "You pulled it the moment you understood the risk. That tells me something." Derek was quiet for a beat. "It tells you I'm not completely incompetent. It tells me you're capable of making the right call when you have accurate information," Claire said, "which is not a small thing. The problem here is not that you make bad decisions. The problem is that you've built a system where accurate information has a very hard time reaching you." He stopped walking. She stopped too. They stood in the corridor, and Derek Holloway looked at the far wall with the expression of a man performing a very specific kind of internal accounting. "You think this is my fault," he said. "I think it's your command," Claire replied. "Which means the culture of this installation is your responsibility. Not because you built every piece of it deliberately, but because leadership shapes culture, whether it intends to or not. When people stop reporting problems, it's usually because they've learned that reporting problems comes at a cost. And that lesson gets taught somewhere, by someone, over time." Derek turned and looked at her. "And you think I taught it?" "I think the decisions you made about how to respond to difficult news over years consistently created an environment where Ethan Parker filed 3 warnings about a genuine safety issue and stopped after the 3rd one because continuing felt more dangerous than staying quiet." She held his gaze. "You may not have intended that, but it happened on your base under your command in the culture you built. So yes, that's yours." Derek said nothing for a long time. When he finally spoke, his voice was quieter than she had heard it. "What do I do?" Not a dramatic question. Not rhetorical. The plain practical question of a man who had moved past the defending stage and arrived at the part where he needed to actually know the answer. "Right now," Claire said, "you get in front of your people, all of them. Senior staff maintenance crews, the junior technicians who've been keeping their heads down hoping nothing bad happens. You tell them what happened. Not a sanitized version, the real one. The standard that wasn't distributed, the reports that were dismissed, the aircraft that got cleared based on outdated information. You tell them what you know, and you tell them you're fixing it. That's going to destroy the readiness ratings," Derek said. "Yes," Claire agreed. "The regional review. We'll see an installation that identified a systemic safety failure, reported it accurately, and took immediate corrective action," Claire said. "Which is considerably better than what they'd see if one of your aircraft had a hydraulic failure mid-exercise with personnel on board." Derek absorbed that. "And Briggs, that's above my authority and yours," Claire said. "The investigation will determine what was deliberate and what was negligence. But either way, it has to be investigated. You know that." He nodded slowly. "There's something else," he said. Claire waited. "The technicians who reported issues and got pushed back, Parker and the others. They followed the rules. They did what they were supposed to do, and the system punished them for it." He stopped. "I need to fix that too." "Yes," Claire said. "You do." They stood there for another moment. Then Derek straightened slightly, not the performance of authority he'd been carrying the day before, but something simpler and more genuine. The posture of a man who had decided what he was going to do next. "I'm going to call a full staff meeting for 0900, he said. "Good," Claire said. "Will you be there?" She shook her head. "This one you need to do alone. It'll mean more coming from you." He looked at her for a moment with an expression she hadn't seen on him before. It wasn't gratitude exactly. It was something more complicated. The look of a man beginning to understand the difference between the leadership he'd thought he was providing and the kind that actually mattered. "Yesterday I told you to get out of my base," he said. "I remember," Claire said. "I was wrong." "I know," she said simply, and she meant it without any edge in it, without any satisfaction. Just the plain fact. She turned and walked toward the operations center because she still had work to do and the morning wasn't finished. The 0900 meeting lasted 47 minutes. Claire did not attend, but Chen gave her a running account of it afterward, with the barely contained energy of someone who had witnessed something they hadn't expected. Derek had stood in front of his entire assembled command officers, NCOs, the maintenance crews, the technicians, the administrative staff, everyone, and told them everything. Not a policy update. Not a memorandum. Him standing in front of the people who worked for him, saying the words out loud. The standard that wasn't distributed. The reports that were dismissed. The aircraft that had flown under unaddressed concerns. The investigation that was now beginning. He named Parker, Chen said. In front of everyone. Said Parker had identified the issue 22 days ago, reported it 3 times through proper channels, and that the dismissal of those reports was a failure of the system that he as commanding officer was taking responsibility for correcting. Claire looked up from her notes. What was the reaction? Chen thought about it. Quiet, he said. Not uncomfortable quiet. More like the way people go quiet when something real gets said in a room that hasn't had a lot of real things said in it for a while. She nodded. And Parker? He was there. He heard it. Chen paused. He didn't say anything. But afterward I saw two of the senior NCOs go over to him. Sergeant Garza was one of them. Another pause. Garza shook his hand. Claire turned back to her notebook and wrote 2 words. Then she closed it. The investigation into how the March notification had failed to reach technical staff moved quickly once the legal officer was involved. By early afternoon, the picture had come into focus with the uncomfortable clarity of something that had been obscured for a long time and was now suddenly and completely visible. Harold Briggs had received the notification. He had understood its implications immediately. Implementing the new threshold would have required re-inspecting 12 aircraft and grounding at minimum 4 of them during the final 30 days before the Regional Readiness Review. The review that determined the following year's budget. The review that Ravencrest had been preparing for months. He had made a calculation. It was not a monstrous calculation. It was the kind a person makes when they are holding 2 competing priorities and have spent enough time in a particular culture to know which one the system actually rewards. The readiness numbers mattered. The budget mattered. The 30-day window mattered. And the hydraulic variance readings in his assessment were close enough to the old threshold that the risk felt manageable. He had been wrong, not maliciously wrong. Not recklessly wrong in the way that comes from not caring. Wrong in the particular way of someone who has been in a system long enough to absorb its unspoken values, who has learned to read what the institution actually prioritizes beneath what it claims to prioritize, and who makes decisions accordingly. That was the part that sat with Claire the hardest. Not the bad actor, the deliberate saboteur. Those were almost easier to handle because their culpability was clear, and the system knew what to do with them. The harder problem was the Harold Briggs problem. The person who made a bad decision inside a structure that had quietly taught him to make exactly that decision, and who had genuinely believed at the time that he was managing the situation responsibly. She was still thinking about it when her phone rang. She looked at the screen. She picked up. "Situation has expanded," said the voice on the other end. Direct, no preamble, the way people talked when they had gotten used to conversations where every word mattered. "We're picking up signals that what happened at Ravencrest with the standard notification isn't isolated. There are 2 other installations in the region with similar gaps in their updated maintenance implementation records, both reviewed positively in the last cycle." Claire stood very still. "How similar?" she asked. "Similar enough that it's not a coincidence," the voice said. "Someone who understood how the standard update tracking system worked could have selectively delayed implementation at multiple installations in a way that would be very difficult to detect unless someone was specifically looking for it. Someone like an administrative coordinator with regional access," Claire said slowly. "That's one possibility. Or someone with enough institutional knowledge to know which installations were under budget review and when," she said. "Also a possibility." "Are you telling me this is coordinated?" A pause. The kind that isn't uncertainty, but is the careful choosing of words. "I'm telling you the pattern is consistent with coordination. Whether it was deliberate, or whether 3 separate installations independently had the same administrative failure at roughly the same time." The voice stopped. "You know what the odds of that are?" Claire knew exactly what the odds were. "I need access to the regional administrative coordination files," she said. "Cross-installation, 90-day window centered on March of last year." "That's going to require a different level of authorization than your current review order." "I know," she said. "Can you get it?" Another pause. Longer. "Make sure you're somewhere secure in the next 2 hours," the voice said. "Someone will reach out." The call ended. Claire stood in the middle of the operations room, surrounded by the ordinary sounds of a base in the middle of its workday, and felt the particular shift that happened when an investigation crossed from the problem you came to solve into something considerably larger underneath it. She had come to Ravencrest to find out why junior technicians had stopped reporting safety issues. She had found that. But underneath it was something else. Something that connected Ravencrest to at least 2 other installations. Something that had the structured fingerprints of a decision made above the base level by someone who understood the administrative machinery well enough to use it as a tool. And somewhere in the movement of paperwork and notifications and filing systems that most people considered the least interesting part of military operations, something deliberate had been buried. She needed to find it before anything else flew. Sure. She found Derek in the maintenance bay at 1400, standing beside the grounded aircraft with his senior staff doing what a commander actually does with a problem once he's decided to stop pretending. The problem doesn't exist. Looking at it directly, asking questions, getting answers, and making decisions. She stood back and watched for a moment without interrupting. How was different? Not transformed. That kind of thing didn't happen in 12 hours, and she had been doing this long enough to be deeply skeptical of sudden conversions. But something in the way he was moving through the space had changed. He was listening differently. She could see it in the way he held his body, when a technician spoke, the slight forward orientation of someone who was genuinely trying to hear, rather than someone waiting for the current speaker to finish so he could respond. Chen appeared beside her. "He's been here for an hour," Chen said quietly. "He's been asking questions about the maintenance process, start to finish. Not the documentation process, the actual physical inspection process. What people check in, what order, what they're looking for, what the hard parts are." "Has anyone told him the hard parts?" Claire asked. Chen smiled slightly. Garza told him that the hardest part was knowing when to push back on a determination that felt wrong. When pushing back had a history of going badly for the person doing the pushing. What did Holloway say? He said he heard that. Then he asked Garza how long that had been true. Claire looked at Derek across the bay. He had just asked the grounded aircraft's primary technician something, and the technician, young, clearly unused to being spoken to directly by the commanding officer, was answering with the slightly stunned focus of someone who wasn't quite sure this was real yet. "Good," Claire said quietly. Her phone vibrated. She looked at the screen. The message was 4 words: clearance approved. Call now. She walked out of this maintenance bay and into the corridor. She made the call. She listened for 4 minutes, asking 2 questions and receiving detailed answers to both. When she hung up, she stood for a moment with her hand flat against the wall. The regional administrative coordination files had been accessed, and what they showed was not an accident, not an oversight, not 3 separate administrative failures happening coincidentally at 3 separate installations at almost exactly the same time. It was a pattern. Clean, deliberate, and constructed by someone who had counted on it being too granular, too buried in the ordinary fog of bureaucratic process for anyone to notice. Someone had not wanted those maintenance standards updated, and Claire now had a very strong idea of who. She turned around and walked back toward the operations center with the particular pace of a person who has just moved from one phase of a problem into the next, and who understands that the next phase is going to be considerably more complicated than anything that has come before. The hydraulic system on one aircraft had been the surface. What was underneath it had roots she was only beginning to trace, and the people at the end of those roots she already knew were not going to welcome what was coming. The name that kept appearing in the regional coordination files was not a name anyone at Ravencrest would have recognized. That was the point. Colonel Warren Steck had spent 19 years building exactly the kind of career that allowed a person to be everywhere and nowhere at once. The administrative backbone of regional tactical air operations. The man whose signature appeared on budget allocation frameworks, logistics coordination, memos and inspection scheduling documents across 6 installations. He was the kind of officer whose name you saw on paperwork, but whose face you couldn't quite place, who had perfected the particular institutional invisibility of someone who controlled the machinery without ever standing in front of it. Claire had run across Steck's name once before, 3 years ago. A procurement irregularity at a forward support installation that had been investigated briefly, attributed to contractor miscommunication, and closed without findings. She had noted it at the time because the explanation had felt too clean. The kind of clean that comes from someone knowing exactly which thread to pull to make the knot loosen without the whole thing unraveling. She was looking at that same quality of clean now, The March notification suppression across 3 installations had not been crude. It hadn't been the work of someone panicking or cutting corners out of laziness. It had been architecturally precise, the kind of thing that required understanding not just where the notification would go, but where the confirmation records would be stored, which administrative coordinators reported to whom, and which installations were far enough into budget review cycles that a delay in standard implementation would look like ordinary bureaucratic lag rather than deliberate interference. That was not the work of a base-level maintenance officer. That was the work of someone who understood the entire regional system from the inside. She spread the files across the table in the operations center. Hard copies because she was operating at a level now where she didn't want anything. She was looking at passing through the base's internal network and began building the timeline by hand. The kind of work that looked like nothing from the outside and felt from the inside like standing in the middle of a very large puzzle and slowly realizing that the picture it was forming was not what anyone had told you it would be. Chin knocked and entered without waiting, which she had already decided she respected about him. "Major Reyes is asking if you need anything." "Tell him yes," Claire said without looking up. "I need everything Ravencrest has on its maintenance contractor relationships for the last 18 months. Invoices, inspection reports, any communications between the contractor reps and senior base staff. And I need it physically printed and brought here. Nothing sent electronically." Chin paused for barely a second, long enough to register that the request had escalated significantly past what this morning had looked like. "Yes, ma'am," he said, and left. Claire went back to the timeline. The suppression of the hydraulic standard hadn't just delayed safety inspections. That was the surface consequence, and it was serious enough on its own. But underneath it, if her read of the pattern was right, it had also created a window, a specific calculable window of time, during which multiple aircraft at multiple installations were operating with maintenance assessments that under the current standard would have required additional inspection. And during that window, the maintenance contractor servicing all 3 installations had submitted invoices for inspection work that, if those aircraft had actually been grounded for the proper inspections, would have been conducted by in-house technical staff rather than contracted personnel. She stopped writing. She went back through the invoices Chen had brought from the first batch and found the figure she was looking for. $2.3 million. That was the total value of contracted maintenance inspection services billed across the 3 installations in the 8-month period following the suppressed notification. Billed for inspections that in-house staff would have conducted for the cost of their existing salaries if those staff had known they needed to. $2.3 million that went to a contractor called Meridian Technical Services. She pulled up Meridian's registration documentation. 3 minutes later, she found what she hadn't been looking for, but should have expected. Meridian Technical Services had been incorporated 18 months ago. Its sole principal officer was listed as a private individual whose name meant nothing to her. But its registered agent, the legal entity that had facilitated its incorporation, was a law firm that appeared in one other context in the files in front of her. It had handled the estate of Warren Steck's recently deceased father-in-law. Not proof. Not anywhere close to proof. The kind of thread that could be coincidence, could be nothing, and could also be the exact thing that explained why someone with regional administrative authority had arranged for a maintenance standard update to disappear from 3 installations at precisely the right moment to create a $2.3 million business opportunity for a company that hadn't existed until 6 months before the opportunity arose. Claire set down her pen. She picked up her phone and called the same number she'd called the night before. "I need a financial investigation opened," she said when it answered. "Meridian Technical Services. Cross-reference Warren Steck. I'll send you what I have." She sent it. Then she sat with the quiet that comes after you've handed something over to people who can do more with it than you can, and waited for what came next. She didn't have to wait long. Derek found her 40 minutes later with the look of a man who had been trying to reach her and had finally tracked her down by physically walking the installation until he found the light on. He stopped in the doorway, looked at the spread of files on the table, looked at her. "This has gotten bigger," he said. "Yes," Claire said. "How much bigger?" She looked at him steadily. I need you to trust my judgment on how much to tell you right now, Captain. His jaw tightened. Not with anger, with the particular frustration of a commander who understood logically that information compartmentalization existed for legitimate reasons, and who was also finding it deeply uncomfortable to be on the outside of it. This is my installation, he said. I know, Claire said. And everything that touches your installation directly, I will tell you. But there are elements of this that extend beyond Ravencrest, and sharing details with you right now could compromise an investigation that needs to move quickly and quietly. She paused. I'm asking you to trust that I'm not keeping things from you for the wrong reasons. Derek stood in the doorway for a moment. Then he came in, pulled out a chair and sat down. What can you tell me? He said. The maintenance standard suppression was not an accident, and it didn't originate here, Claire said. Briggs received a notification that had already been delayed at the regional coordination level before it reached him. He made a bad decision with it, and he's going to answer for that. But he's not the origin. Derek absorbed that. Someone above base level interfered with a safety standard. That's what the evidence is pointing to. I can't tell you more than that right now. Is my base at risk? Derek asked. Right now today, is there something happening here that I need to be protecting my people from? It was the right question, the commander's question, not about his reputation, not about the investigation's implications for his career, but about his people. Claire registered it. The immediate safety issues have been addressed, she said. The grounded aircraft, the other assessments that needed reevaluation, those are being handled. What's happening now is about accountability, and about making sure the structure that allowed this doesn't stay intact. She looked at him. But there's something you can do that matters. Tell me. The culture change you started this morning. The meeting, the transparency with your staff that needs to continue. Loudly. Whatever happens with the investigation above your level. What happens on this base is yours. The people here need to see that reporting problems is safe, and they need to see it consistently over time, not just today. She paused. That's the work that never makes the headlines. But it's the work that actually prevents the next Ethan Parker situation from becoming something worse. Derek nodded. Slowly, with the weight of someone accepting something that was going to require sustained effort, rather than a single dramatic gesture. I can do that, he said. I know you can, Claire said. He stood up, moved toward the door, then stopped. The person above base level who did this, will they be held accountable? That's what I'm working on, Claire said. He nodded once, left. Claire turned back to the files. She had approximately 4 hours before the next call, and 4 hours was enough time to build a case that was either going to end a very specific career or confirm that she had misread a coincidence as a pattern. She began to write. The call came not from the number she expected, but from a different one entirely, and the voice on the other end was senior enough that Claire straightened slightly without meaning to. Commander Donovan, the voice said. We've had a chance to look at what you sent. And, Claire said, Meridian Technical Services filed its first invoice with the Regional Contracting Office 4 days after the March notification was logged in STEC's coordination system. A pause. 4 days. Claire was quiet. The incorporation happened 8 weeks before that, the voice continued, which means someone knew the notification was coming, knew what the implementation of the new standard would require across the regional installation network, incorporated a service company positioned to fill that requirement, and then ensured the standard wouldn't be implemented through in-house staff. Another pause. That is not a coincidence. No, Claire agreed. We're opening a formal investigation. STEC is being placed on administrative leave effective this afternoon. His access to regional coordination systems has already been suspended. The voice paused again. You are not to make contact with STEC or any of his staff. The investigation team will handle that from here. Understood, Claire said. What's the status at Ravencrest? The commanding officer has begun transparency measures with his staff. The immediate safety issues are addressed. Briggs is cooperating with the base legal officer. She paused. Holloway handled the hard part well. Good. A brief silence. You should know Steck has allies in the regional chain. This is going to get complicated before it gets clean. I'd recommend staying at Ravencrest until the investigation team arrives and can formally document the evidentiary chain. How long? Claire asked. 24 hours, maybe 36. All right, she said. The call ended. She set the phone down and let herself feel for exactly a moment the particular exhaustion that came not from lack of sleep, but from sustained concentrated focus, maintained over hours, in which every decision mattered and every misread could cost something she couldn't afford to cost. Then she stood up, rolled her shoulders, and went to find Chen. She found him in the corridor outside the maintenance records room with a stack of additional printed files under his arm and the alert expression of someone who had found something and was trying to determine whether it was what he thought it was. "You need to see this," he said without preamble. She took the file he held out, read the top page, read it again. It was an inspection report, one of the Meridian Technical Services reports from the batch that had been invoiced against Ravencrest. Standard format, properly signed, dated 4 months prior. But the aircraft tail number on the report did not match any aircraft currently or previously assigned to Ravencrest. Claire looked up. "This tail number." "I checked it against the regional aircraft registry," Chen said. "That aircraft is assigned to Keeler Air Station, 60 miles from here." She looked back at the report. Meridian invoiced Ravencrest for an inspection conducted on an aircraft at a different installation. "Either that," Chen said carefully, "or the report was generated for an aircraft that doesn't exist, and the tail number was taken from the regional registry at random. Both possibilities meant the same thing in different directions. Either Meridian had billed Ravencrest for work performed elsewhere, which was fraud, or it had billed for work never performed at all, which was also fraud. "How many Meridian reports came through Ravencrest?" Claire asked. 14, Chen said. "Pull all 14 tail numbers. Cross-reference every one against the Ravencrest aircraft assignment log for the dates on the reports." Chen nodded and turned to go. "Chen." He stopped. "How did you know to look at this?" He turned back. He had the expression of someone deciding how honest to be about something that might sound arrogant. "Because the formatting was too consistent," he said. "Real inspection reports have variability. Different inspectors write things slightly differently. These 14 reports read like they came from a template. Same sentence structures, same phrasing patterns, same section lengths." He paused. "Nobody writes 14 reports that look exactly alike unless they're not actually writing them from scratch each time." Claire looked at him for a moment. "Good work," she said. Chen went back to the records room. Claire stood in the corridor with the document in her hand and felt the shape of what she was looking at settle into something definite. Meridian Technical Services had not just been positioned to capture maintenance work that the standard suppression created. It had been billing for work it hadn't done. Fabricating inspection reports with enough technical language to pass a surface review. Banking on the fact that the administrative layer between the billing and the work was thick enough and the people managing it distracted enough that nobody would sit down with 14 reports and notice they all sounded like the same person talking. $2.3 million. For work that had not been performed on aircraft whose pilots had been flying them without knowing that the inspections logged in their maintenance records were fictional. She called the senior number again. "The scope of the fraud is larger than I initially reported," she said when it picked up. "Meridian invoices at Ravencrest include reports for aircraft not assigned to this installation and preliminary read reports for inspections that may not have been performed at all. I'm sending the documentation now. You need to cross-reference every Meridian invoice across all 3 installations against actual aircraft assignment and maintenance logs." A pause. Then, "How confident are you?" "Confident enough to tell you we may have aircraft flying right now at other installations whose maintenance records include fictional inspection reports," Claire said. The pause this time was longer. "Stand by," the voice said. What happened in the next 90 minutes moved with the specific velocity of a system that has been mobilized at its highest level of urgency. Claire knew it was happening because Derek came to find her for the 3rd time that day, and this time his face had the look of a man who had received communications from above his command chain that had recalibrated his understanding of what was happening on his base. "I just got a call from Regional," he said. He closed the door behind him. "They're suspending flight operations at 3 installations pending an emergency maintenance records audit, including mine." He looked at her. "They told me it was related to an ongoing investigation. They didn't give me details." "I know," Claire said. "Is this what you found?" he asked. "The records thing. Part of it." Derek sat down. For a moment, he just sat there with his hands flat on the table, a man processing the specific sensation of discovering that the problem he thought he was managing was attached to something much larger and moving much faster than he'd understood. "People could have been killed," he said, not dramatically, just the plain statement of a man arriving at a fact. "Yes," Claire said. "If the hydraulic issue Parker flagged had reached failure during flight, and if the inspections that were supposed to catch other issues weren't actually conducted." She stopped. "Yes, people could have been killed." Derek was quiet for a long time. "Ethan Parker could have been killed. Flying on an aircraft he'd told us was a problem." "He wasn't assigned to that aircraft as a crew member," Claire said. "But yes, someone was." Something moved through Derek's expression. Something that had nothing to do with command authority, or institutional accountability, or career implications. Something that was just a person understanding in full the human dimension of what had nearly happened. "I want to talk to him," Derek said. "Parker." "Yes." "I think that's a good idea," Claire said. She didn't sit in on the conversation between Derek Holloway and Ethan Parker. That was not hers to witness. But she could see them through the glass of the briefing room where they sat, and she could read the shape of it from the outside. Derek leaning forward with his forearms on the table, the posture of a man not performing authority, but actually present. Ethan Parker, starting with the careful stillness of someone who had learned that conversations with people above his rank carried invisible costs, and then gradually incrementally shifting into something more open, as he realized that this one was different. They talked for 31 minutes. When Derek came out, he stopped next to Claire. "He didn't report the 4th time," Derek said, "because 2 months before he flagged the hydraulic issue, he'd gone to Callahan about a cooling system irregularity. Callahan told him the reading was normal." 3 days later, Parker found out the aircraft had been quietly taken offline for exactly the issue he'd reported. Nobody told him he'd been right. Nobody acknowledged it. The aircraft just disappeared from the rotation for 2 weeks and then came back. Derek paused. So when the hydraulic thing came up, he already knew what the pattern looked like. Report something. Get told you're wrong. Watch the problem get quietly handled without anyone admitting you were right. Stop reporting. Claire nodded. "He wasn't wrong about anything," Derek said. "He was right about everything, and the system made him feel like being right was the dangerous thing to be." "Yes," Claire said. "I'm going to fix that," Derek said. And this time, there was nothing complicated in his voice. No qualification, no hedge. Just the plain statement of a man who had decided. Claire believed him. At 1600 hours a second call came through from the senior line, and the information it carried changed the texture of the next several hours entirely. The cross-installation audit of Meridian Technical Services invoices had returned its preliminary findings. Across the 3 installations, 41 inspection reports had been submitted for aircraft not assigned to those facilities on the dates in question. An additional 23 reports showed formatting anomalies consistent with template generation rather than individual authorship. The total invoiced value of reports now under question had been recalculated. $4.8 million, more than double what Claire had estimated from the Ravencrest invoices alone, and the investigation team now formally active and moving with the authority of a cleared joint agency task force had obtained STEC's financial records through emergency judicial authorization. The records showed 17 transfers over 14 months from an offshore holding account to a personal account held by STEC's brother-in-law, the sole principal officer of Meridian Technical Services. The investigation was no longer about a maintenance standard. It was about a deliberate, sustained criminal scheme to defraud the military conducted by a regional officer who had used his administrative access to suppress safety standards and create artificial demand for a fraudulent contractor. He had a financial interest in across multiple installations over more than a year. And the aircraft that had flown on the strength of those fraudulent inspections had carried personnel who had no idea the safety net beneath them was made of paper. Claire received this information sitting alone in the operations center, and she let it settle fully before she moved. This was the part of the work that didn't look like anything from the outside, the moment when the magnitude of what you'd found became completely real. Not satisfying, not victorious, real. Real people had flown an aircraft whose inspections were fictional. Real people. Ethan Parker. The other technicians who'd been pushed back had been right about things that mattered in a system that had penalized them for being right, administered by people who were being paid to make the system look clean while it rotted underneath. She stood up. There was still work to do. At 1800 hours. She was back in the corridor outside the maintenance bay when she heard the sound that changed everything. Not a dramatic sound. In fact, it started as almost nothing. A shift in the ambient mechanical noise of the installation. The kind of thing that only registers if you've spent enough time around aircraft systems to have developed an ear for wrong. Then the alarm. Not the standard maintenance alert. The full emergency tone, the one that meant something was not contained, not preventable, not a drill. She moved before she'd consciously processed the direction. The hangar. Maintenance Hangar 2. She knew it from the first day's orientation walk, knew where it sat, relative to the operations center, knew the layout from the base documentation she'd reviewed at 3:30 the previous morning when she hadn't been sleeping. She ran. The alarm had been going for 12 seconds when she hit the corridor that connected to Hangar 2, and she could already smell it. The specific combination of heated metal and chemical accelerant that meant a fire had gotten into something it wasn't supposed to touch. Personnel were moving in both directions, some toward the hangar, some away from it. The controlled urgency of a base executing emergency protocol. She caught a sergeant by the arm as he passed. "How many inside?" she said. "3 confirmed," he said. "Maintenance crew. They were doing a final inspection on the grounded aircraft when something in the secondary system." He stopped. His face said the rest. "Routes," she said. "Primary entry is compromised. Fire started between the main access and the crew position." He was already moving. "Emergency response is 2 minutes out." 2 minutes. She had been inside Hangar 2 twice. She had studied the base documentation, and she knew with the specific certainty of someone who had spent 20 seconds doing the mental calculation that there was a secondary maintenance access route that most of the current personnel wouldn't know because it predated the last renovation and had been administratively reclassified as a storage corridor in 2019. It was still there. She turned and moved. Derek's voice hit her from behind before she'd gone 10 steps. "Donovan." She didn't stop. He caught up, grabbed her arm, the same arm he'd grabbed the first morning, the motion he'd used to try to stop her from doing something he'd decided she didn't have authority to do. This time it was different. "You can't go in there," he said. Not as a command, as the statement of a man who was terrified. "The secondary access route," Claire said. "West corridor. It runs behind the fuel management station and comes out behind the crew position." Derek stared at her. "I know this building," she said. "The renovation sealed." "The renovation moved the access point 8 feet north," she said. "The route itself is still clear. I saw it on the original construction plans." Derek looked at her. 2 full seconds. The kind of look that contains an entire calculation, everything he knew about her, compressed into a rapid and honest assessment. "It's still a fire," he said. "Yes," she said. "And there are 3 people on the other side of it." She pulled her arm free. She went. The secondary access route was exactly where the original documentation had shown it. 8 feet north of where the renovation signage indicated, behind a utility panel that was secured with a standard maintenance latch rather than a lock. She went through it at a pace that was fast and controlled, not reckless. Because reckless got people killed, but without hesitation. Because hesitation in a burning building was its own kind of recklessness. The heat hit her before she could see the fire. She could hear the structural language of it, the specific crackling and metallic expansion that told her the main burn was to her left, between her position and the primary entrance, which meant the 3 crew members were likely to her right, backed against the far wall of the bay. She moved right. "Sound off?" she called out. "Sound off right now." For one terrible second, nothing. Then, here. A voice. Male. Coughing. Here. Another. Closer. The third came from the floor not far ahead, a young voice trying to stay low the way they were trained to and managing it. "Stay down," Claire said. "I have a route. Can you move?" "Vasquez can't walk," the first voice said. "His ankle. He went down when—" "That's fine," Claire said. "Who's closest to me right now?" "I am." The second voice, a few feet ahead. "Give me your hand," she said. "Contact." She pulled him to her position and put her hand on his shoulder. "Keep your hand on me and stay low. Don't let go." Then back to the first voice. "You're going to take Vasquez's arm. Both of you follow my voice." "He can't." "One arm over your shoulder," Claire said. "You can do that. You have to." A beat. Then the sounds of movement. Someone being hauled upright. "Okay," the first voice said, strained. "Okay, we're moving." She moved. The route back through the secondary access was 40 feet of focused, deliberate movement in conditions that were getting worse by the second. The air quality dropped. She could feel the person behind her begin to slow the particular heaviness that came when someone was running close to their limit. "Keep moving," she said. Not loud, not harsh, just steady. "I need you to keep moving." 30 feet. 20. Then the utility panel and the latch and the corridor beyond it, and the air, relatively cleaner, mercifully cooler, and the sound of the emergency response team arriving, voices and equipment, and Derek Holloway standing in the corridor with the expression of a man who had spent the last 4 minutes experiencing something he would never fully describe to anyone. The 3 crew members came through. Vasquez went directly to the medical team, ankle fractured, smoke inhalation, going to be all right. The other 2 stood in the corridor with the particular look of people who have just crossed a threshold. They weren't sure they were going to cross and are still processing which side they're on. Claire stood with them for a moment, breathing, letting her own system recalibrate. Derek looked at her. She looked back at him. Neither of them said anything for several seconds. Then Derek turned to his personnel and started giving the orders that needed giving. Clear the corridor, account for all base personnel, establish a perimeter, coordinate with fire response. The commander's work. Claire stepped back and let him do it. She walked to the far end of the corridor, sat down against the wall, and let her hands rest on her knees. Her heart rate was doing what it always did after something like that. The delayed adrenaline response, the specific trembling that came after, rather than during the body catching up to what the mind had pushed it through. She breathed through it. 4 minutes later, Chen appeared and crouched down in front of her with a water bottle. "The investigation team," he said. "They just called. They're arriving early. First team lands at Ravencrest in 3 hours." Claire took the water. "Good," she said. "Also—" Chen paused. "The fire investigation crew is saying preliminary read on the ignition point is the secondary electrical conduit on the grounded aircraft, the one with the hydraulic issue." He stopped. "If that aircraft had flown this morning—" "I know," Claire said. Chen was quiet for a moment. Then, "If you hadn't grounded it—" "Ethan Parker flagged it 22 days ago," Claire said. "I just made sure someone listened." Chen nodded. He stood up. Claire leaned her head back against the wall and looked at the ceiling. Somewhere above the base, the sky was moving into evening. Somewhere in the regional chain of command, Warren Steck was learning that the walls of a very carefully constructed scheme were coming down. Somewhere in the base, 3 crew members who'd been on the wrong side of a fire were breathing air they shouldn't have had to work that hard to reach. And somewhere in the maintenance bay, A young technician named Ethan Parker was being told that the aircraft he'd flagged 3 weeks ago had just provided the clearest possible confirmation that he'd been right all along. She pressed her palms flat against the floor, stood up. The investigation team was 3 hours out. She had work to do before they arrived. The investigation team arrived at 2043 hours. There were 6 of them. Claire had worked with 2 before a quiet, methodical woman named Specialist Agent Dana Howell, who ran financial forensics with the kind of precision that made accountants nervous, and a former JAG officer turned federal investigator named Marcus Tate, who had the particular quality of stillness that came from spending years in rooms where people were trying very hard not to tell him the truth. They came off the helicopter with equipment cases, and the focused economy of movement that told Claire the 3-hour lead time had not been spent. They had been working in transit coordinating, building the evidentiary framework that would turn what she had documented at Ravencrest into something that could survive a federal courtroom. Tate found her first. He looked at her, the way people looked at someone who had just come out of a fire, not at the physical evidence of it, because she'd cleaned up, but at the particular quality a person carries in their face afterward. The slight settling around the eyes. The extra steadiness that comes from having spent adrenaline and arrived on the other side of something. "You look like your day was longer than mine," he said. 3 crew members in a maintenance fire, Claire said. "They're all stable." Tate absorbed that without drama. Connected. "The fire originated in the secondary electrical conduit of the aircraft I grounded this morning. The one with the hydraulic variants," Parker reported. She paused. "Preliminary investigation read is accidental ignition from the existing fault condition, but I'd want your team to take a look before I call it coincidental." Tate looked at her for a long moment. "You think someone accelerated the failure?" "I think the timing is worth examining," Claire said carefully. "Steck's access to regional coordination systems was suspended this afternoon. If he or someone connected to him understood that the aircraft being grounded was part of what led investigators here, and if that aircraft continuing to sit in Hangar 2 was a liability." She stopped. "I'm not saying it was deliberate. I'm saying I'd feel better with your team's assessment." "We'll look at it tonight," Tate said. He paused. "Good call on the grounding." "That was Holloway's call," Claire said. "I gave him the information. He made the decision." Tate nodded once, the nod of someone who was filing that detail in the correct place. "Where do you want to start?" Claire asked. "With everything you have," he said. "In order, from the beginning." They worked through the night. Not dramatically. That was the honest truth of investigative work at this level. It looked like people sitting around tables with documents and laptops, and an enormous amount of coffee talking in precise language about specific things, building a structure out of pieces that individually meant nothing and collectively meant everything. Dana Howell spread the Meridian financial documentation across one end of the table and went through it with the thoroughness of someone who found pleasure in accuracy, the way other people found pleasure in music. She had a habit of very quietly when she was reading, and the humming stopped every time she found something significant replaced by the small sound of a pen moving. The pen stopped a lot. "The wire transfer sequence," she said at one point without looking up. "The timing between the invoice submissions and the transfers to the brother-in-law's account is remarkably consistent, within 48 hours every time, for 14 months. "Which means," Claire asked. "Which means whoever was managing the money wasn't nervous about it," Howell said. 48 hours is not someone moving funds quickly because they're scared of getting caught. It's someone operating on a schedule because they considered the process routine. She looked up. That level of comfort usually means either the person believed they were completely safe, or they had reason to believe the oversight system that should have caught this was compromised. "Or both," Tate said from the other end of the table. "Or both," Howell agreed. Claire looked at the transfer timeline. 14 months of systematic extraction run, with the confidence of someone who had done the institutional math and determined the probability of detection was low enough to treat the operation as stable, and they had been right. Until a statistical anomaly in informal maintenance request volume had caught the attention of someone who was specifically looking for exactly that kind of anomaly. 63% drop. That was the thread that had pulled all of this out. At 01:30, Tate's phone rang. He looked at the screen, excused himself, and stepped into the corridor. He was gone for 11 minutes. When he came back, the quality of his stillness had changed, not visibly to most people, but Claire had spent enough time watching skilled investigators to recognize the particular compression that happened when new information changed the shape of a case. "Tell me," she said. Tate sat down. He placed his phone on the table with the deliberateness of a man choosing how to deliver something. "Steck made a call this afternoon," he said. "After his access was suspended. Personal cell, not a government line. The call went to a number registered to a logistics coordination firm in Virginia." He paused. "That firm has a contract with the Regional Inspection Oversight Office, the office responsible for auditing maintenance contractor compliance." The room went completely quiet. "He called his auditor," Howell said flatly. "He called someone at the firm that holds the oversight contract," Tate said. "We don't yet know whether the individual he called is personally connected to the scheme or whether Steck was attempting to make contact with someone he believed could—" He stopped. "Either way the call happened. The content is being recovered." Claire looked at the table. She was doing the calculation that the new information required, not the financial one, but the structural one. If the oversight mechanism had also been compromised, or if Steck had believed it was reachable, then the safety net that should have caught Meridian's fraudulent invoices 18 months ago had not failed randomly. It had been positioned not to catch them. "How far does this go?" she said. Not to Tate specifically. More thinking out loud. "That's what we're going to find out," Tate said. "But I want to be direct with you, Donovan. What started as a base-level cultural assessment has touched a federal fraud investigation, a potential criminal conspiracy spanning multiple installations, and now possibly a compromised oversight mechanism." He looked at her steadily. "The people you've identified have resources, and some of them are going to understand very shortly that this has moved well beyond the administrative level." "You're telling me to be careful," Claire said. "I'm telling you that careful means something different now than it did when you walked through the gate here 2 days ago," Tate said. Claire held his gaze. "I've operated in environments where the stakes were higher than this." "I know your file," Tate said simply. There was a brief silence. Then Claire nodded, not performing agreement, but accepting the information for exactly what it was. An honest assessment from a competent person who was not trying to manage her, but to protect the work. "All right," she said. "What do you need from me tonight?" She briefed them for 2 more hours. Every document, every conversation, every thread in the order she'd found it. Tate asked questions that were surgical in their precision, not clarifying questions, but the kind that tested the evidentiary strength of each piece, and found the ones that needed additional documentation before they could support the structure. At 03:40, he told her to sleep. 4 hours, he said. "You're going to need to be functional tomorrow." She started to object. "Donovan," he said with the quiet firmness of a man who was not making a request. "The next 12 hours are mine to run. Your job right now is to make sure you're useful at 0800. Go." She went. She was awake at 07:20, without an alarm, the way she always was. Body clock recalibrated to the operational rhythm. The particular alertness of someone whose nervous system had learned to maintain a certain readiness level, regardless of how much sleep it had gotten. Derek was in the corridor outside the investigation room. He had the look of a man who had slept perhaps 3 hours and had been awake since 0500, making sure his base was operational, despite the suspended flight status, the ongoing fire investigation, and the presence of a federal team working out of his operations center. "Coffee," he said, and held out a cup. She took it. "How are your crew members?" she asked. "Vasquez is going to be out 4 to 6 weeks on the ankle," Derek said. "The other 2, Torres and Kim, they were discharged from medical at 0600. Minor smoke inhalation." He paused. "Torres asked me this morning who the woman was who came in through the secondary route." Claire drank her coffee. "What did you tell him?" she said. "I told him she was the person who knew the building better than the people who worked in it," Derek said. Claire looked at him. There was something in his face she hadn't seen there before. Not admiration exactly, because Derek Holloway wasn't the kind of man who wore admiration openly. Something quieter than that. The particular regard of someone who has updated their understanding of another person and is still in the process of integrating it. "I need to ask you something," he said. "Go ahead." "Yesterday morning I told you that you were operating outside your authorization, that you had no right to be talking to my people, looking at my maintenance records, making recommendations about my aircraft." He stopped. "I was building a case to have you removed." "I know," Claire said. "The JAG officer I had working on it found something in the scope of your authorization that I hadn't seen," Derek said. "Your review order, it's not a standard logistics inspection authorization. The clearance level attached to it is—" He stopped again, choosing his words. "I don't have visibility into what you actually are, or where you actually come from. But I understand now that the reason nobody could find your file is that your file isn't in a system I have access to." Claire said nothing. "I'm not asking you to explain it," Derek said. "I just want you to know that I understand now that what I did when you arrived and how I treated you was—" He looked at her directly. "I was operating on assumptions that weren't based on facts. That's something I spend a lot of time telling my people not to do." "You corrected it when it mattered," Claire said. "I grounded an aircraft. You told your people the truth in a building full of people who had learned to expect something else." Claire said. "That was harder than grounding the aircraft." Derek looked at her for a moment. Then he nodded a single unadorned nod, the kind that meant a person had heard something and was keeping it. "The investigation team," he said. "Do they need anything from me this morning?" "Probably," Claire said. "I'd make yourself available." He straightened. Back into command posture, but without the performance of it, the real version, the one that had been there all along under the version he'd been wearing for the inspection. "I'll be in my office," he said. Tate found Claire at 0900 with the particular energy of someone who had been awake all night and had arrived at the other side of it carrying something significant. "The fire investigation," he said. Claire put down her coffee. "The ignition point in the secondary electrical conduit," he said. "Our team looked at it this morning alongside the base fire investigation crew." He paused. The conduit failure was consistent with the existing fault condition. However, there is a secondary finding. "What is it?" "The junction box that connects the secondary conduit to the aircraft's main electrical system had been accessed recently, within the last 72 hours. The access left tool marks on the housing that are inconsistent with the standard maintenance access protocol for that aircraft type. The information landed with the particular weight of something that reordered everything around it." "Someone accessed that junction box," Claire said. "Someone accessed it in a way that wasn't documented using tools that don't match the standard maintenance kit for that aircraft within 72 hours of the conduit failure." Tate looked at her. "The fire may not have been accidental." Claire sat very still. "Who had access to that hangar in the last 72 hours, she said. "That's the question we're pursuing this morning," Tate said. "Holloway is pulling access logs now. The hangar uses a keyed access system. We'll have a full log of every entry point used in the last week by end of morning." "And Briggs," Claire said. Tate looked at her. "Briggs has access to hangar too," she said. "He's been cooperating with your investigation, which means he knows what you're looking at and roughly how close you are. If someone connected to this scheme wanted to ensure that aircraft didn't become further evidence." "Briggs has been in his quarters under soft restrictions since yesterday afternoon," Tate said. "He did not have unsupervised access to that hangar last night." "But the 72-hour window starts before yesterday afternoon," Claire said. Tate nodded. "Yes, it does." "Who else on this base has connections direct or indirect to STEC or to Meridian?" "We're building that picture right now." "Build it faster," Claire said. The access log came through at 10:15. Chen brought it to Claire personally, which told her something about how the morning had redistributed his loyalties, not dramatically, but in the way that happened naturally when a person spent enough time in the vicinity of honest work. She read through the log twice. There were 11 entries into Hangar 2 in the 72 hours preceding the fire. 8 were documented maintenance visits with corresponding work orders. 2 were administrative entries by base personnel with routine access, and 1 at 22:47 hours 2 nights prior was an entry logged under an access code that corresponded to the base contractor liaison office. Contractor liaison, the office that served as the on-base administrative point of contact for Meridian Technical Services. Who holds the contractor liaison access code? Claire asked. Chen looked at the log. It's a shared code, he said, not individually assigned. It's used by anyone in the contractor coordination office. How many people is that? 4, he said, plus their supervisor. Who's their supervisor? Chen checked his tablet. His expression shifted. Master Sergeant Briggs, he said. Before he was placed under restriction, he had supervisory authority over contractor liaison operations, in addition to his maintenance officer role. Claire stood up. Get Tate, she said. Right now. What followed was the fastest and most controlled 14 minutes Claire had experienced in a career that contained a significant number of fast and controlled situations. Tate got the information. Tate made 2 calls. The first was to the base security officer to confirm that Briggs's soft restriction had been properly documented and monitored. The second was to the federal prosecutor who had been assigned to the case overnight, who authorized an immediate escalation of Briggs's status from cooperative witness to material person of interest. At 1:31, 2 investigators and a base security officer went to the quarters where Briggs had been housed and asked him to accompany them. Briggs went without incident. But when the investigators entered his quarters to conduct the inventory authorized under his elevated status, they found something on the desk that nobody had expected. A personal laptop. Open. With a partially composed email on the screen, unsent, apparently abandoned addressed to a private account that the financial forensics team would spend the next 6 hours tracing to a third-party data relay that connected back through 2 intermediary accounts to Warren Steck's personal email. The email contained 7 words that answered the question of whether the fire had been accidental. It said, "The aircraft is gone. They know everything. The aircraft is gone. They know everything." Claire read the transcript of the email twice when Tate brought it to her. She read it the way she read things that were simultaneously the answer and the opening of something new. Because if Briggs had written that message, and had written it to Steck, or to someone connected to Steck, then Briggs had known the fire was going to happen before it did. And that meant he was not a man who had made a series of bad decisions under institutional pressure. How was a man who had known what the grounded aircraft represented and had taken steps to ensure it didn't survive to testify? He knew Parker's report was legitimate from the beginning, Claire said. Tate looked at her. 22 days ago, when Parker first flagged the hydraulic issue, Briggs dismissed it, she said. But Briggs knew the standard had changed. He'd received the March notification. He understood that under the current threshold, Parker's reading wasn't a borderline variance, it was a clear flag. Which means when he told Parker he misunderstood the data, he knew that wasn't true. How was protecting the assessment? Tate said. A legitimate hydraulic inspection would have required a contractor call-out under the service agreement, which would have been another Meridian invoice. Except this time, with Parker's documented concern on record, the inspection would have needed to be real, and a real inspection would have found the actual fault condition, Claire said. And a real fault finding on a documented concern creates a paper trail that starts asking questions about every other Meridian inspection report in the system. So he buried Parker's report, Tate said. 3 times, Claire said. And when I showed up and started pulling threads and the aircraft got grounded anyway, and the investigation started moving. She stopped. He knew what that aircraft represented. He knew what a proper investigation of it would produce. The silence that followed was not comfortable. 3 crew members were in that hangar, Claire said. I know, Tate said quietly. Vasquez has a broken ankle. Torres and Kim spent the night in medical. I know, Tate said again. They sat with that for a moment, not performing it, just letting it be the fully real thing that it was, that a man who had started by suppressing a safety report to protect a financial scheme had, when that scheme was threatened, been willing to destroy evidence in a way that had put 3 people in danger. The distance between the first decision and the last one looked enormous from the outside. From the inside, Claire knew it almost never felt that way. It felt like a series of steps, each one only slightly further than the last. Each one rationalized in the moment, as necessary and manageable, until the person who had made the first small choice was standing somewhere that their earlier self would never have recognized. That was the thing that made it real. Not the villain. The progression. Derek Holloway took the news about Briggs with the specific stillness of a man absorbing something that required him to recalibrate everything he thought he knew about the people around him. Tate delivered it directly, which Claire had asked him to do. Derek deserved to hear it from the investigator, not filtered through anyone else. He sat behind his desk and listened without interrupting. When Tate finished, Derek was quiet for almost 30 seconds, long enough that it stopped being a pause and became something more deliberate. "He put my people in that building," Derek said. His voice was completely level, the kind of level that had nothing to do with calm. "The investigation will determine the precise connection between Briggs's actions and the fire's ignition," Tate said carefully. "He accessed the junction box," Derek said. "My people went into that building because of a fire that started at a junction box he accessed." He stopped. "Don't walk carefully around that. I need to understand it clearly." Tate looked at him for a moment. Then, "Yes, that's what the evidence indicates." Derek nodded. One nod, the kind that closes something. "What do you need from me?" he said. "Your cooperation in the access log documentation and a formal statement about Briggs's duties and supervisory responsibilities," Tate said. "You'll have it within the hour," Derek said. He stood up. "Is there anything else right now?" "No, Captain." Derek came around from behind his desk. He moved toward the door, then stopped. He didn't turn around. "I promoted him," Derek said. 18 months ago. I put him in the supervisory role over contractor liaison because he was organized, he was experienced, and his numbers were always clean." He paused. "I thought clean numbers meant good work." Nobody said anything. "I know better now," Derek said. He walked out. Ethan Parker heard about Briggs at 1200, the way most junior personnel heard about things, through the particular speed of base communication that had nothing to do with official channels and everything to do with the fact that people talked. He came to find Claire, which surprised her slightly, not because it was out of character for the person she'd come to understand him to be, but because seeking out a senior officer for a conversation that wasn't required took a specific kind of resolve that not everyone had. He knocked on the open door of the operations center where she was working. "Ma'am," he said, "do you have a minute?" She put down her pen. "Sit down." He sat. He had the expression of someone who was holding something in and trying to determine the right way to set it down. "I heard about Briggs," he said. "I can't confirm or deny specifics of an ongoing investigation," Claire said. "I know," he said. He paused. Another pause. He looked at his hands, then at her. "I reported something 3 times. I got told I was wrong 3 times. And I believed them." He stopped. "I don't mean about the hydraulic system. I knew I was right about that. I mean..." He struggled for a moment. "I believed them when they made me feel like the problem was that I wouldn't stop pushing. Like the problem was me. And I stopped." "Yes," Claire said. "If I hadn't stopped," he said. "If I'd filed a 4th time or gone around Briggs or..." "You would have faced consequences that were real and significant," Claire said. "And you'd already experienced enough of them to know exactly what they would look like." She looked at him steadily. "You didn't stop because you were wrong or weak. You stopped because a system that was supposed to protect you from exactly that situation had been specifically compromised to make stopping feel like the reasonable choice." Ethan was quiet. "That's not on you," Claire said. "The fact that you filed 3 times with documentation with clear technical justification and kept the records. That's why we're sitting here. Your reports are part of the evidentiary chain that built this case." "I didn't know they'd be used for that," he said. "You didn't need to," she said. "You just needed to be right and to document it. You did both." He sat with that for a moment. Then something shifted in his face. Not resolution, because this kind of thing didn't resolve cleanly or quickly, but a slight settling. The beginning of a person integrating something complicated into their understanding of what had happened to them and what it meant. "The 3 people in the fire last night," he said. "Torres and Kim. I know them." "They're all right," Claire said. "Yeah." He looked at the table. "I keep thinking if the aircraft had flown this morning. If you hadn't—" "It was grounded," Claire said. "It didn't fly." "Because you listened," he said. "Because Captain Holloway listened," she said. "When someone gave him information he could no longer ignore." She paused. "That's how it's supposed to work. That's what broke here. And it's what's being fixed." Ethan Parker nodded slowly. "Is it actually going to be fixed?" he asked. "Not just here, in general. Is it actually—" "I don't know," Claire said honestly. "Not everywhere, not all at once. But here now, with what's been documented and what's been exposed, yes. This specific version of this specific failure on this specific base is being fixed." She looked at him. "And the record of how it was found and who found it first is permanent." He looked at her. "Your name is on those reports," she said. "That doesn't go away." At 600 hours, Tate's team made an arrest, not Briggs. Briggs had been in custody since morning and was cooperating with the speed of a man who understood that the email on his laptop had fundamentally changed his position and who had a lawyer whispering in his ear about the value of being useful. The arrest was of the logistics coordination firm employee Steck had called the previous afternoon a mid-level administrator named Garrett Foss, who, when the content of the call was recovered and presented to him alongside the financial records showing 11 months of payments from a Meridian-adjacent account to a shell company he controlled, made the calculation that lawyers make when the evidence is too specific to fight, and the question becomes not whether, but how much. Foss started talking at 16:17. By 1800, the case against Warren Steck had expanded to include 3 new financial instruments, 2 additional shell companies, and a systematic pattern of invoice approval that traced back through the regional contracting office with the kind of documented precision that federal prosecutors described later as unusually clean for a case of this scope. Warren Steck was formally arrested at his home at 1843. Claire received the notification as a text from Tate. 4 words. "Steck is in custody." She read it. Set the phone down, picked it up again, and typed back, "Good." Then she put the phone in her pocket and went to find Derek Holloway. Howe was in the maintenance bay for the second time that day, standing with Sergeant Garza and 2 of the junior technicians in front of the grounded aircraft. The bay had the particular atmosphere of people doing serious work in the aftermath of something serious, focused, quiet, purposeful. Derek saw her coming and walked to meet her. "Steck is in custody," she said. Derek absorbed that. His jaw moved slightly. "All of it. The whole scheme. Enough of it," Claire said. "The rest is for the prosecutors to complete." He nodded. "Briggs?" he asked. "Cooperating," she said. "The investigation will determine the full range of charges." Derek looked at the aircraft, then at his people working around it, then back at her. "My installation was being used," he said. "My maintenance records, my aircraft, my personnel, everything I thought I was building here was being used as infrastructure for something I had no idea existed." "Yes," Claire said. "And I made it easier," he said. "The culture I built, the way I managed information, the way I responded to people who brought me things I didn't want to hear, I made it easier for all of this to stay hidden." "You also made it harder," Claire said. He looked at her. "The moment you had accurate information, you acted on it," she said. "The moment you understood what the data showed, you grounded the aircraft. The moment you understood what the morning meeting needed to be, you stood in front of your people and said the hard things." She paused. A different commanding officer in that seat could have spent 3 more days protecting his readiness numbers and hoping the problem resolved itself. "You didn't." "I almost did," Derek said quietly. "The first 24 hours I almost did." "But you didn't," she said. "And in the end, that's the part that mattered." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "What happens now to the base? To the personnel? The readiness review will be delayed while the audit completes, Claire said. The reinstated maintenance standards will require an inspection cycle that takes several weeks. There will be a formal review of the base's reporting culture and communication systems. She paused. None of that is going to be comfortable. No, Derek agreed. But at the end of it, you'll have an installation that works the way it's supposed to, she said. Not the way it looked like it was working, the actual way. Derek turned and looked at his people in the maintenance bay. Garza was showing one of the younger technicians something on a clipboard, not ordering, but explaining the particular patience of an NCO who had decided that the next person was going to understand the thing properly. Garza asked me this morning if he could set up a formal channel for maintenance concerns, Derek said. Anonymous submission direct to my desk with a documented response requirement. He said he'd had the idea for 2 years, but never thought it would go anywhere. What did you tell him? Claire asked. I told him to have a proposal on my desk by Friday, Derek said, and that his name was going on it as the originating idea, not mine. Claire looked at him. Good, she said. They stood there for a moment in the way two people stand when they've been through something together that neither of them will fully describe to anyone who wasn't there. Then Derek straightened. He put his hands behind his back in the old posture, but it sat differently on him now. Not armor, not performance. Just the physical language of a man who knew what he was doing and why. Thank you, Commander, he said. Thank you, Captain, Claire said. She turned and walked back toward the operations center. Behind her, the maintenance bay hummed with the honest sounds of real work tools and voices, and the particular quality of a place where people had decided to do things correctly. And somewhere in that sound, buried underneath everything else, was the specific silence of problems that had been afraid to speak, finally beginning to find their voice. The formal debrief began at 0800 the following morning. Tate ran it. Dana Howell sat to his left with 3 inches of printed documentation and the specific focus of someone who had spent the night turning raw information into something that could survive cross-examination. 2 additional investigators. Claire hadn't met before, occupied the far end of the table, federal level, their presence confirming that what had started as a base-level cultural assessment had migrated into territory that required a different category of oversight entirely. Derek Holloway sat across from Claire. He'd been invited, which Tate had told her was unusual. She understood why he'd done it. The debrief would establish the formal record of what had happened at Ravencrest, and the commanding officer of the installation deserved to be present when that record was constructed. It was a courtesy Tate didn't have to extend, and extending it said something about how he read Derek's conduct over the preceding 48 hours. Derek noticed. Claire could tell by the way he sat, not relaxed, because this was not a relaxing situation, but without the defensive bracing that had characterized his posture when she'd first walked into his installation 3 days ago. Tate opened the debrief with a summary of findings that was precise and completely without dramatics. The suppressed March notification, the 3 installations affected, the Meridian Technical Services fraud, the fabricated inspection reports, the financial trail to Warren Steck, Harold Briggs's role in the scheme and in the fire, Garrett Foss's cooperation and what it had revealed, Steck's arrest. He delivered all of it in approximately 12 minutes in the same tone a person used to read a weather forecast. Not because it wasn't serious, but because professional seriousness looked like precision, not theater. When he finished, the room was quiet for a moment. Then Derek said, "How long?" Tate looked at him. "How long had Steck been running this?" Derek said. "The full scope, not just the maintenance scheme." Tate glanced at one of the federal investigators who gave a small nod. Financial forensics indicates the foundational structure, the shell companies, the contracting relationships was established approximately 3 years ago, Tate said. The maintenance standard suppression was the most recent and most operationally dangerous element. But there are earlier iterations of the scheme we're still mapping. Procurement irregularities at 2 other installations, a logistics contract modification that rerouted approximately $800,000 through a related entity. He paused. Steck was patient. He built it slowly enough that each piece looked like ordinary bureaucratic variation. Derek absorbed that. 3 years, he said quietly. At minimum, Tate said. The weight of that sat in the room. 3 years of a system being used as a vehicle for fraud by someone who understood it well enough to make the fraud invisible. 3 years of installation commanders, like Derek, making decisions based on data and reports and assessments that had been shaped at the edges by someone with a financial interest in what those commanders decided. Claire watched Derek process it. She could see the moment when the full scope of it landed, not just the Ravencrest piece, not just Briggs, but the larger architecture and his own unwitting position within it. The way his expression moved through something that was neither guilt nor absolution, but the complicated territory between them. The other installations, Derek said. Their commanding officers, did they know? There is no current evidence that any base-level commanding officer was aware of or complicit in the scheme, Tate said carefully. The operation was specifically designed to function below the level at which commanding officers would encounter it directly. Derek nodded. He understood what that meant. It meant that Steck had studied command structures well enough to know exactly how much space existed between what a commanding officer knew and what happened 2 or 3 levels beneath him. And he had built his operation in that space. He knew how we worked, Derek said. Better than most people who don't work inside the system, Tate agreed. The debrief took 3 hours. Claire answered questions for most of it. The sequence of her observations, the specific documents that had flagged the anomalies, the conversations that had built the evidentiary foundation. She answered everything with the same directness she brought to all her work, without editorializing and without omitting the parts that reflected on her own judgment calls. At one point, one of the federal investigators asked her about the decision to enter Hangar 2 through the secondary access route. Was that a sanctioned response? He asked. Were you operating within the parameters of your assignment? The room went slightly still. Not tense. Claire was not the kind of person who generated tension with that kind of question, but attentive the way people get when they sense that the answer matters in ways beyond the procedural. My assignment is to identify and address operational failures that put personnel at risk, Claire said. 3 personnel were at risk. I had information that allowed me to address it. So yes, I was operating within the parameters of my assignment. The federal investigator looked at her for a moment, then wrote something in his notes. Derek was looking at the table, but the corner of his mouth had moved, not quite a smile, but the involuntary acknowledgement of someone who recognized a very clean answer to a loaded question. Tate moved on. At 1100, the debrief formally concluded. Tate closed his folder and looked around the table. The formal record will be completed and filed within 72 hours, he said. I want to thank Commander Donovan for the quality and precision of her preliminary documentation. It significantly accelerated what would otherwise have been a considerably longer investigative timeline. He paused. And I want to note for the record that the commanding officer of this installation, upon receiving accurate information, acted decisively and appropriately. That is not always the finding in cases of this type. He said it without fanfare. The way true things got said when the person saying them had no interest in theater. Derek looked at the table for a moment. Then he looked up and nodded once. Thank you, he said. The investigation team began breaking down their operation that afternoon. It was a systematic process, documentation boxed systems. Cleared the particular reverse choreography of a team that had come in with a specific purpose and was now transitioning to the next phase of work that would happen elsewhere in courtrooms and federal offices and rooms that operated at a different altitude than a tactical air installation in the middle of its own accounting. Howell found Claire in the operations center at 1400 packing the last of her own files. The Parker documentation, Howell said. She was carrying a folder. The formal record of his 3 reports, the timeline of dismissals, the evidentiary weight it carried in establishing the suppression pattern. She set it on the table in front of Claire. I wanted you to see the final version before it was filed. Claire opened it. Read the first page. Ethan Parker's name appeared 6 times in the first 2 paragraphs, not as a footnote, not as a supporting reference, but as a primary source. The person whose documented technical observations had been the thread that, when pulled, had revealed the entire structure underneath. This is good, Claire said. It's accurate, Howell said with the satisfaction of someone for whom those two things were always the same. The prosecutors are going to rely on it heavily. His reports are direct evidence that the suppression was targeted, that real legitimate safety concerns were being systematically dismissed, not because they were wrong, but because they were inconvenient. She paused. He should know what that means. He will, Claire said. Howell picked up her case. She was halfway to the door when she stopped and looked back. You know what the thing is that I've been thinking about since last night, she said. Claire looked at her. The 63%, Howell said. That was the number that sent you here. The drop in informal maintenance requests. If that number had been 60% instead of 63, or if the analyst running the cross-base audit had rounded differently, or if the report had gone to someone who didn't have the specific background to recognize what that pattern meant. She stopped. This whole thing continues, undetected, indefinitely. I know, Claire said. 3 more years maybe. 5. More installations. More aircraft with fictional inspection reports. More junior technicians learning that the safest thing they can do is keep their heads down. Howell looked at her. You were the right person looking at the right number at the right time. Parker was the right person asking the right question 3 weeks before I got here, Claire said. I was just the person who finally listened. Howell considered that. Then she picked up her case and walked out. Jean came to find her at 15:30 with the expression of someone who had something to say that was not part of any official process. He stood in the doorway for a moment, doing the calculation. Claire had come to recognize as characteristic of him the brief, precise assessment of what he wanted to say against what the situation permitted. I've been in the Army 8 years, he said. I've worked under 4 commanding officers. I've submitted a total of 31 formal maintenance or safety observations through official channels. Claire looked at him. 11 of them received formal responses, he said. The other 20 were either logged with no follow-up, redirected to a category that required no action, or... He stopped. One of them I found in a general administrative file 2 years after I submitted it. Misfiled. Never processed. He wasn't performing this. He was just telling her the way a person tells someone a true thing, because the moment has finally created a space where the true thing can be said. What was that one about? Claire asked. Fuel system pressure variance on a training aircraft, he said. 2 months after I submitted it, that aircraft was taken offline for a major fuel system overhaul. Nobody connected the two things. Nobody told me my report had been right. He paused. I kept submitting reports anyway. But I understand now, I understand it from the inside, the way Parker understood it, why people stop. I know, Claire said. What I wanted to say, Chen continued, is that I've been watching how you work for 3 days, and I've been thinking about whether there's a version of what you do that lives inside the regular system. Not as an external review, as a permanent part of how the system monitors itself. He stopped. Is that something that exists? Claire looked at him for a moment. Not in the form it should, she said honestly. But the documentation from this case is going to reach people who think about exactly that question. What gets built from it is up to them. Chen nodded. I'm going to stay in the Army, he said, as if he'd been deciding something and had reached a conclusion. Not because everything works the way it should, because someone has to be in the room when it doesn't. Claire studied him. How old are you? 28, ma'am. You're going to do significant work, she said. He straightened slightly. Not from the compliment, from something closer to purpose. Thank you, ma'am, he said. He left. The thing nobody had told Claire when she'd first chosen this work was that the endings were never clean. Steck would be prosecuted. The federal case was strong. Howell had made sure of that, and the cooperation of Foss, and eventually Briggs had filled in the gaps that documentary evidence alone couldn't reach. The charges were serious. The evidence specific, the paper trail, the kind that juries understood without needing specialized knowledge. But the $4.8 million in fraudulent invoices, the aircraft that had flown on fictional inspections, the personnel who had trusted maintenance records that were partly invented, the 2 years of exposure that nobody had known about until now, none of that unhappened because the man responsible was in custody. The damage that had been done was real and permanent, even if its future continuation had been stopped. Harold Briggs would face charges that were harder to look at. The fire in Hangar 2 had not killed anyone, but it had not failed to kill anyone through any virtue of Briggs's planning. Vasquez's broken ankle was the physical record of what Briggs had been willing to accept as collateral consequence. That fact would live in the case file alongside everything else. The 3 installations would go through extended audit and inspection cycles. Flight operations would remain suspended for weeks. Readiness ratings would take hits that would affect budget allocations and would require explanations that went up chains of command and created ripples of accountability and reassignment that Claire would never fully trace. None of it was tidy. It was real, which was better than tidy, but it didn't come with the satisfying resolution of a problem solved and closed. It came with the specific satisfaction of a problem found and named, handed to the right people, and set in motion toward the accountability it required. That was the work. That had always been the work. She was finishing the last of her own documentation at 1800 when Derek knocked on the open door of the operations center. He had changed out of his duty uniform into the slightly less formal version, same discipline, marginally less armor. He was carrying 2 cups of coffee, which had become over the past 3 days the gesture of choice for people at this installation who wanted to initiate a real conversation. He set one on the table in front of her. She picked it up. He sat down across from her, and for a moment they just sat in the companionable quiet of 2 people who had been through something together and didn't need to fill the silence with noise. Garza submitted the reporting channel proposal this afternoon, Derek said. Claire raised an eyebrow. That was fast. He'd had it half written for 2 years, Derek said. He just needed somewhere to send it. He looked at the cup in his hands. I approved it this afternoon. It goes live next week. Good, Claire said. I also put Parker in for a formal commendation, Derek said. Not a ceremony, a documented commendation in his permanent file with the specific language that his 3 reports constituted accurate identification of a safety-critical issue that was subsequently validated by federal investigation. He paused. I want there to be a record that being right about something difficult cost him something in this installation, and that the installation formally acknowledges that. Claire looked at him. You can't erase what happened to him, she said. No, Derek agreed. But I can make sure the record shows both things, what he experienced and what he was worth. He stopped. He came to see me this morning, before the debrief. He didn't ask about the commendation. He didn't know I was going to do it. He came to ask if he could be part of the team that conducts the new maintenance standard implementation review. What did you tell him? I told him he was leading it, Derek said. Claire was quiet for a moment. That's exactly right, she said. Derek nodded. He drank his coffee. Then he set the cup down and looked at her with the directness of a man who had been thinking about something and had decided to say it. I've been thinking about the first morning, he said. When you walked in, the way I responded, the things I said and did in front of my personnel. He stopped. I've been trying to understand what I was actually reacting to, because I've told myself it was about authorization, about protocol, about chain of command, and those were real concerns technically. But I don't think that was actually it. Claire waited. I think, Derek said slowly, that I looked at you and I saw someone who might find something I didn't know was there. And I think some part of me understood that if something was there to find, I should have already known about it. He looked at her. The way I treated you in those first hours was about my ego, about not wanting to be the commanding officer who didn't know what was happening in his own command. And I made it about you instead. The room was quiet. That's an honest thing to know about yourself, Claire said. It's not a comfortable one, Derek said. No, she agreed. But the uncomfortable true things are the only ones worth knowing. He was quiet for a moment. Then, when I grabbed your arm in the hangar that first morning, you don't have to. I want to, he said, simply. When I grabbed your arm and told you to get out of my base, I was treating you as a problem to be removed rather than a person with authority and purpose. He looked at her directly. That was wrong. Not procedurally wrong. Wrong. Claire held his gaze. I know, she said. And I know you know it. What matters is what you did next. I made it worse before I made it better, Derek said. Most people do, she said. The ones who never make it better are the ones who never acknowledge the worse. Derek nodded slowly. They sat in silence for another moment. Then Derek stood up, and the quality of his movement was different from anything she'd seen from him over 3 days. Not the authority he performed when he needed people to see the command. Not the defensive posture he'd carried when he was trying to protect something, not the deliberate transparency of someone learning to do a new thing. Just a man standing up after a real conversation. The helicopter comes at 0600, he said. I checked with the team. I know, Claire said. Will you need anything before then? No, she said. I'm good. He moved toward the door. Stopped. Turned back the gesture that had become over the course of 3 days, the signal that the real thing he wanted to say was coming last. That young technician, he said. Parker. When you talked to him the first day when you told him his name was on those reports, and it didn't go away. Derek stopped. He looked at something that wasn't in the room. He told me about that conversation. He said it was the first time in 2 years that someone in this installation treated the fact that he'd been right as something worth acknowledging. His voice was level, but had a quality in it that hadn't been there before. I keep thinking about the 2 years between that conversation and when I should have had it myself. Claire looked at him. You're having it now, she said. That's not nothing. Derek Holloway held her gaze for one more moment. Then he nodded the same single unadorned nod she'd seen from him in the debrief room. The nod that meant a person had taken something in and was keeping it. He walked out. She finished her documentation at 22100. The last file closed, the last notation made the formal record of what had happened at Ravencrest, complete and ready for the people who would carry it forward from here. She sat for a moment in the quiet of the operations center, with her hands flat on the table, and let herself feel fully what the last 3 days had been. Not the professional satisfaction of a completed investigation, though that was there. Not the relief of the immediate safety crisis resolved, though that was there too. Something more complicated than either of those. The maintenance bay was still running. She could hear it, the distant specific hum of people working on real problems with real tools. The sound of an installation doing the honest, unglamorous labor of keeping aircraft safe for the people who flew them. Garza was probably still in there. Chen might be. The junior technicians who had spent 2 years learning that noticing problems was dangerous were right now learning something different. That was the thing that would last. Not the investigation, not the arrest, not the federal case that would move through its processes over the next year and eventually produce verdicts and consequences and legal records. What would last was the change in what happened when a 23-year-old technician noticed something wrong and had to decide whether to say so. That was the work. The real work. The work that didn't look like anything dramatic from the outside and contained everything that mattered from the inside. She was on the flight line at 0545, which was 15 minutes before she needed to be. The morning was doing what mornings did on a military installation, organized, purposeful, the particular productive noise of a place that had work to do and was doing it. She could hear the maintenance bay from here. Aircraft movements in the distance, voices carrying the clean economy of people communicating for function rather than performance. She heard footsteps behind her and turned. Ethan Parker. How was in his duty uniform, and he had the look of someone who had gotten up early, specifically to be somewhere. He stopped a few feet away and stood with the straightness of a person who wasn't quite sure of the protocol for this situation. I heard the helicopter is 0600, he said. It is, Claire said. He nodded. He was quiet for a moment, looking at the sky with the expression of a young man who had something to say and was deciding how to say it. I wanted to tell you something before you left, he said. Go ahead, she said. He looked at her. For about 2 years I thought the problem was me. I thought I was too particular, or too stubborn, or not good enough at letting things go. I thought the way the system responded to me was the system telling me something true about what I was worth. He stopped. And then you sat down with me in a maintenance corridor and asked me to explain what I was seeing. And you listened like the information actually mattered. His voice was steady. I know that's your job. I know you do it for every person you talk to. But I wanted you to know what it felt like from this side. Claire looked at him. It felt, he said carefully, like being real again. Like the thing I knew was real was actually real, if that makes sense. It makes complete sense, Claire said. He nodded. Then he reached into his uniform pocket and produced a piece of paper folded once. He held it out. She took it, unfolded it. It was a handwritten note, not long, 8 lines, the kind of thing a person wrote by hand, because typing it would have taken away something that mattered. Commander Donovan, I'm going to run the implementation review the way you would have run it. Every report treated like it matters, because it does. Every person who files one told they were heard because they deserve that. And if I'm ever in a position to do for someone else what you did for me in that corridor, I will. Parker. Claire folded the note, put it in her pocket. You're going to be excellent at this work, she said. Parker looked at her steadily. I'm going to try every day to be, he said. Behind them, the sound of rotors broke the morning. The Black Hawk coming in from the east exactly on schedule. The kind of precision that meant the people flying it cared about what they did. Parker stepped back. Claire turned toward the sound. The helicopter touched down with the specific controlled authority of a machine operated by people who were very good at operating it. The crew chief moved fast, efficient. The rotors kept turning. She walked toward it. She was almost at the door when she heard her name. She turned. Derek Holloway was standing 20 feet away. He had come onto the flight line without her noticing, which meant he had been there for a while. He was in full uniform, standing straight, and he had the expression of a man who had made a decision about something and was executing it. He raised his hand in a formal salute, not a casual gesture, not a wave. A full military salute, held the kind that was given between officers of different ranks, when one of them wanted the record to show exactly what they thought. Claire held his eyes for a moment. Then she returned it. Clean, correct, held for the same beat. Derek dropped his salute first. He did not say anything. He didn't need to. Everything that needed to be communicated had been communicated in the particular language of people who understood that sometimes the most significant things were said without words. Claire turned back to the helicopter and stepped aboard. The crew chief secured the door. The engine sound shifted the change in pitch that meant they were going. Through the small window, she could see the flight line. Ethan Parker, standing where she'd left him watching. Derek still at attention, already turning back toward his installation, with the purposeful stride of a man who had a lot of work to do and had decided to start immediately. And somewhere in the maintenance bay, she could no longer see the sound of real work continuing, the particular honest labor of people who had been reminded that what they noticed mattered, that the problems they found were worth finding, that speaking up cost something and was worth the cost. The helicopter lifted. Ravencrest fell away beneath her. Claire turned forward and let the installation go, not because it didn't matter, but because her job had never been to stay. Her job was to find the thing that was buried. Name it clearly enough that it couldn't be reburied, and hand it to the people who had to live with it long enough to fix it. She had done that. What happened next at Ravencrest? The reporting channels, and the implementation reviews, and the slow, patient rebuilding of a culture where truth had a safe place to land, that was Derek's work, and Garza's work, and Ethan Parker's work. The unglamorous, daily, permanent work of people who had decided to do their jobs honestly, in a system that didn't always make honesty easy. That was the work that actually mattered. She had just made it possible to begin. The helicopter moved east into a morning that was doing what mornings did when you were high enough to see clearly, opening wide, full of the specific and ordinary light that fell the same way on every base and every installation and every room where someone was deciding right now whether to say the true thing or the safe thing. Some of them would choose the safe thing. Some of them would choose the truth. And somewhere in that choice, repeated 1,000 times a day, by people whose names would never appear in any investigation report, was the actual structure of whether the whole thing held. Claire Donovan had spent her career believing it could hold. 3 days at Ravencrest had not changed that. They had confirmed it. Because the strongest thing she had found here was not the evidence against Warren Steck, and it was not the paper trail that built the federal case, and it was not even the secondary access route through a burning hangar that she'd known from a document she'd read at 0330 on a morning when she couldn't sleep. The strongest thing she had found here was a 23-year-old technician who had been told 3 times that he was wrong, who had documented his concerns carefully every single time, and who had kept the records. Because he had understood at the level where real things were understood that the truth was worth having in writing, even when no one was ready to hear it. That was what held the whole structure up. Not the commanders, not the investigators, not the helicopters or the clearances or the systems built to catch the failures. The people quiet enough to notice, brave enough to say so, and stubborn enough to write it down. The woman nobody wanted on their base had found exactly what she came to find. And the base that had tried to remove her was because of that still standing.